year is 1880, and the Arizona Territory is a crucible of heat, dust, and desperate ambition. Our story unfolds in Redemption Gulch, a town clinging to existence on the edge of the known world. Its main street is a chaotic artery of life, choked with the grit of the desert and the sweat of men seeking fortune. Amidst the ramshackle saloons and dusty general stores stands a single beacon of order and cleanliness, Blackwood's Fine Meats. The building is immaculate, its whitewashed facade a stark rebuke to the surrounding decay. It is a place of respect, of quality, and home to a secret so profound it would eventually poison the very soul of the town, turning its residents into unwitting accomplices to a series of unspeakable acts. The story of Silas Blackwood is not merely a tale of murder, but a chilling chronicle of how evil can flourish in plain sight, celebrated and even consumed by those it preys upon. Inside, the air is thick with the rich, savory aroma of smoked and spiced meats, a scent that promises sustenance and comfort in a land that offers little of either. The proprietor, Silas Blackwood, is a man of meticulous habits and quiet, almost monastic, piety. He moves with a deliberate grace, his apron impossibly white, his cleaver a gleaming extension of his own hand. Customers from all walks of life, miners, ranchers, and the town's few respectable families, flock to his counter, praising his craft. His specialty, a spiced jerky of unparalleled flavor and tenderness, has earned him a reputation that extends for miles. It is the pride of Redemption Gulch. The rhythmic, dull thud of his cleaver on the thick wooden block is a constant, reassuring sound in the town, the heartbeat of a thriving enterprise. No one ever questioned the source of his success. They simply savored the results. Behind the pristine shop, under the relentless glare of the Arizona sun, long racks stand like skeletal sentinels. Here, dark, glistening strips of meat are left to cure, slowly transforming in the oppressive heat. This is the final stage of Silas Blackwood's celebrated process, where the sun itself is enlisted as his primary tool. The sight is a common one, a testament to his industrious nature. Yet, for those who might have looked closer, a subtle wrongness hung in the air. The buzz of flies here is a constant, frenzied symphony, and the sweet, smoky scent of the curing jerky carries a faint, almost imperceptible undertone, a cloying, organic sweetness that doesn't quite belong. It is the smell of a carefully guarded secret, mingling with the spices and smoke, a fragrance that would one day become synonymous with abject horror. This account begins where official records end, in the territory of local legend. For decades after the events transpired, old prospectors and weathered locals would speak in hushed tones of the Sunshine Butcher. They would recount the tale of a jerky so sublime, so profoundly delicious, that it was said to be otherworldly. They claimed its flavor was a complex tapestry of savory, sweet, and a hint of something wild and unidentifiable, a taste that, once experienced, was never forgotten. The legend framed Silas Blackwood not as a man, but as an artist of a dark and forbidden craft, a purveyor of a delicacy whose recipe was born of a terrible, pragmatic evil. The story served as a grim warning, a reminder that the most exquisite pleasures can sometimes conceal the most monstrous of truths, and that the devil often works with the most ordinary of tools. Redemption Gulch was a place of ghosts long before Silas Blackwood began creating his own. It was a thoroughfare for the rootless, a temporary haven for prospectors on their way to the goldfields, drifters who fell from the newly laid railroad lines, and countless others whose names were as transient as their presence. These were the forgotten people, the anonymous faces of the frontier whose disappearances were noted with a shrug, if they were noted at all. The loose grip of frontier law, administered by a selective town marshal, meant that justice was a luxury reserved for established citizens. The fate of a lone drifter was of no consequence to anyone. This pervasive social indifference created the perfect ecosystem for a predator like Silas to operate, not in the shadows, but in the blinding light of day, his cruelty masked by the town's own callousness. The chilling nexus of this history lies in an undeniable, mathematical correlation. The periods when Blackwood's special batch of jerky was most plentiful, when the racks behind his shop were heavy with curing meat, directly coincided with the peaks in these disappearances. The town's singular culinary triumph was inextricably linked to its silent, unseen losses. The very individuals society had deemed disposable were, in a horrifying twist of fate, being processed, perfected, and returned to the community that had ignored their plight. They were consumed at church picnics, packed in the saddlebags of traveling ranchers, and savored in the homes of the very people who would have turned them away. The secret ingredient in Silas Blackwood's famous jerky was not an exotic spice, but the flesh of the forgotten, purified by the sun and sold back to an oblivious populace. This legend is an echo that has endured, a chilling piece of a history that refuses to be buried. And since these stories travel through time and across distances, we invite you to mark your place in this investigation. Tell us in the comments what city you are watching from and the exact time on your clock. With your presence now recorded in our own digital ledger, we can turn back the pages of the archive. Let us return to that sweltering summer of 1880, to Redemption Gulch, and witness the arrival of a man whose presence would finally expose the first crack in the butcher's immaculate facade. The arrival of Reverend Thomas Hale in the summer of 1880 was a quiet affair, a stark contrast to the boisterous and often violent rhythm of Redemption Gulch. A young man barely in his late 20s. His frame was slight, and his face still held the pallor of the Boston Divinity School he had so recently left behind. He stepped off the stagecoach into a wall of heat and a world painted in shades of ochre and rust. His black wool suit, a symbol of Eastern propriety, was immediately coated in a fine layer of dust, an unwelcome baptism into the harsh realities of the Arizona Territory. As he looked upon the town's chaotic main street, a collection of ramshackle buildings simmering under an unforgiving sun, he felt a profound sense of mission, an idealistic conviction that he could bring a semblance of order and grace to this untamed frontier. He was tragically unaware that the most profound disorder here was not loud and chaotic, but silent, meticulous, and deeply respected. In his first few weeks, Reverend Hale dedicated himself to his congregation with a fervent energy. He visited families in their modest homes, listening to tales of hardship, drought, and the constant, gnawing uncertainty of frontier life. It was during these pastoral visits that he first encountered the town's casual acceptance of disappearance. When he inquired about a family member or a hired hand mentioned in a previous letter, the answer was often a resigned shrug, followed by the phrase, "Oh, they just moved on." The words were always delivered with a finality that discouraged further questions. It was a local vernacular for the forgotten, a verbal tombstone for the countless souls who drifted into Redemption Gulch and were swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. To Hale, this pervasive apathy was a spiritual ailment far more concerning than the gambling in the saloons or the brawls in the street. It was a deep-seated callousness that had become part of the town's very character. Among the faces in his small, sparsely attended Sunday services, one stood out for its quiet intensity: Silas Blackwood. The butcher was a model of piety, his head always bowed in solemn prayer, his voice a low and steady presence in the singing of hymns. He presented himself to the Reverend as a humble servant of both God and the community, a man whose success was a testament to hard work and divine favor. His donations to the fledgling church were consistent and generous, his demeanor always respectful, almost deferential. Hale initially saw him as a potential pillar for his new ministry, a symbol of stability in a transient world. The butcher's hands, so skilled with the cleaver and knife, were always immaculately clean, his apron a startling white against the dusty backdrop of the church. He was a portrait of righteous prosperity, and the Reverend saw no reason to question the source of his blessings. This perception was solidified when Silas Blackwood made a particularly magnanimous offering to the church's newly established charity pantry, intended to feed the hungry families of out-of-work miners. He arrived one afternoon bearing several large cloth-wrapped bundles, which he presented with quiet pride. Inside was a small mountain of his famous spiced jerky, its rich, savory aroma instantly filling the small vestry. The scent was intoxicating, a complex blend of smoke, salt, and a secret mix of spices that promised sustenance and deep satisfaction. Reverend Hale accepted the gift with profound gratitude, seeing it as a true act of Christian charity. He could not have known that this gesture was a monstrous perversion of the communion ritual, that he was unwittingly preparing to distribute the very essence of the town's missing and forgotten back to the community that had cast them aside. The first discordant note in this symphony of placid normalcy was struck by a young ranch hand named Elias Vance. He was a fiery, earnest young man with sun-scorched skin and a perpetually worried brow. After a Sunday service, he pulled Reverend Hale aside, his voice a low, angry tremor. He claimed that Silas Blackwood had cheated his family, purchasing a head of their finest cattle for a fraction of its worth by exploiting their desperate need for cash. Elias spoke of Blackwood's cold, unyielding eyes and the predatory stillness with which he conducted the transaction. It was the first time anyone had spoken of the butcher with anything other than reverence. The accusation hung in the air, a direct contradiction to the public image of the pious, quiet, community-minded artisan. For Hale, it was a troubling claim that tarnished the butcher's impeccable facade, suggesting a deep-seated avarice beneath the veneer of piety. Disturbed by the ranch hand's story, Reverend Hale found his gaze drawn more frequently toward the butcher. He began to notice things he hadn't before. A few days after Elias Vance's complaint, Hale witnessed a brief, silent exchange between the two men across the dusty main street. There were no words, no overt threats. There was only a look from Silas Blackwood, a flat, dismissive glare so devoid of emotion, so utterly cold, that it made the desert heat feel like a winter chill. It was the look of a man swatting away a fly, an expression of supreme and final judgment. The young ranch hand, visibly shaken, turned and walked away quickly. Hale felt a profound sense of foreboding settle in his stomach. In that single, fleeting moment of interaction, he had not seen a respected merchant dealing with a disgruntled customer. He had seen a predator sizing up his prey. Less than a week later, Elias Vance was gone. The official story, quickly circulated and just as quickly accepted, was that he had run off to join the silver rush in Tombstone, leaving his family and his troubles behind. The town marshal made a few cursory inquiries before closing the matter, declaring it yet another case of a restless youth seeking a faster fortune. The town of Redemption Gulch sighed its collective, indifferent sigh and moved on. The disappearance was absorbed into the local lore of men who just move on. But for Reverend Thomas Hale, the explanation was a hollow, ringing lie. The timing was too precise, too convenient. He could not shake the image of that cold, predatory glare. The young man's passionate anger had not seemed like that of someone planning to flee. It was the anger of someone determined to fight for his family's honor. The disappearance of Elias Vance became an obsession for the Reverend, a splinter in his soul that he could not dislodge. He began to watch Silas Blackwood with a fearful, analytical eye. He noted the man's unvarying routine, the early mornings in the slaughterhouse, the rhythmic, percussive thud of the cleaver that echoed through the town, the meticulous arrangement of cuts in his shop window, the very aspects of the butcher's character that the community admired, his discipline, his cleanliness, his unwavering consistency, now appeared to Hale as something else entirely. It was not the wholesome diligence of an honest craftsman, but the rigid, obsessive methodology of a man governed by a dark and hidden purpose. The normalcy that had once been reassuring now felt like a carefully constructed lie, a stage upon which a terrible, unseen play was being performed. Hale's mind began to race, connecting the disparate threads of his short time in Redemption Gulch. He revisited the casual conversations about the countless drifters and prospectors who had vanished without a trace. He thought of the town's callous refrain, "They just moved on." Had they all moved on? Or had they been processed? The idea was so monstrous and so utterly unthinkable that he initially dismissed it as a product of his overactive imagination, a dark fantasy born of the frontier's inherent brutality. Yet, the suspicion lingered, a persistent whisper in the back of his mind. He started to wonder if the town's social indifference wasn't just a passive flaw, but an active, essential ingredient that allowed an unspeakable evil to operate not in the shadows, but in the full torrid, blinding light of the Arizona sun. One sweltering afternoon, as the day's heat began to wane, a familiar aroma drifted from Silas Blackwood's property and settled over the town. It was the rich, smoky scent of a new batch of jerky being laid out to cure on the long racks behind the shop. The scent, which had once seemed so appetizing and wholesome, now carried a nauseating undertone for the Reverend. It mingled with the dust and the heat, a cloying sweetness that clung to the back of his throat. He looked toward the butcher shop. where the racks were now laden with fresh, dark strips of meat glistening under the descending sun. The sight, once a symbol of the town's singular culinary pride, now seemed like a grotesque monument to an unspeakable harvest. For Reverend Hale, the unsettling normalcy of Redemption Gulch had finally, irrevocably, curdled into the certainty of horror. The days that followed were a crucible for Reverend Hale's faith. His sermons became fraught with a desperate, veiled urgency, his prayers in the small, dusty church taking on the quality of a man pleading for a sign, for some form of divine intervention that might illuminate the darkness he felt closing in around him. He continued his pastoral duties, but a chasm had opened between him and his congregation. He saw them not as a flock to be guided, but as unwitting participants in a vast, unspoken horror. The casual conversations, the shared meals, the very act of breaking bread, all felt tainted by the terrible knowledge he suspected but could not yet prove. His isolation was absolute, a silent torment in a town that prided itself on its simple, straightforward virtues. Every smiling face seemed to hide a complicity he could not bear to contemplate, and every bite of food offered to him felt like a test of his resolve. His solace, if it could be called that, was found in the early morning hours, high in the church's modest wooden steeple. It was a habit he had formed upon his arrival, a way to greet the dawn and survey his new domain before the heat and the noise of the day began. From this vantage point, Redemption Gulch was laid out below him like a map of human endeavor, its dusty streets and weathered buildings a testament to a stubborn, fragile existence. He would bring with him a small, brass spyglass, a parting gift from his father, and watch the town slowly awaken. In those quiet moments, suspended between the earth and the vast, indifferent sky, he could almost believe in the possibility of order and grace. He could almost forget the cold, predatory glare of the butcher and the gnawing certainty that a profound evil was operating at the very heart of the community. On one particularly still and oppressive morning, with the sun just beginning to breach the horizon and cast long, distorted shadows across the main street, Hale raised the spyglass to his eye. His gaze swept over the familiar landmarks. The saloon, still quiet, the general store, its windows dark, the homes from which thin tendrils of smoke were just beginning to rise. He deliberately avoided looking toward the eastern edge of town, where Blackwood's fine meat stood in its stark, whitewashed purity. He did not want to see the rhythmic plume of smoke from the smokehouse, or the figure of the butcher moving with his unsettling, meticulous grace. He feared what he might see, and more than that, he feared the confirmation of what he already suspected. The spyglass felt heavy in his hand, no longer a tool for observation, but a potential instrument of damnation, capable of revealing a truth he was not prepared to face. Inevitably, his gaze was drawn to the source of his obsession. He angled the spyglass towards Silas Blackwood's property, his breath catching in his throat. The long, curing racks behind the shop, which had been empty the day before, were now laden with fresh strips of dark, glistening meat. Even from this distance, he could imagine the scene with a sickening clarity. The thick, humid air, the frenzied buzzing of innumerable flies, the slow drip of rendered fat onto the parched earth below. The sight was a common one, a symbol of the butcher's industry and the town's prosperity. But for Hale, it was a grotesque tableau. Each strip of meat was no longer a cut of beef or venison. It was a question, a silent accusation. He felt a wave of nausea as he watched Blackwood himself move among the racks, adjusting the strips with a practiced, almost tender care. He was about to lower the instrument, to turn away from the nauseating spectacle, when a flicker of light caught his eye. It was a brief, almost imperceptible glint of silver against the deep crimson of the meat, a tiny spark in the nascent morning sun. He blinked, thinking it a trick of the light, a reflection off a stray buckle or a flaw in the spyglass lens. It was too small, too insignificant to be anything of note. Yet, the image was seared into his mind. He tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it as a stray piece of metal, perhaps a shard from a tool. But a cold, prickling dread began to crawl up his spine, an instinctual certainty that what he had seen was not random. It was something specific, something that did not belong in a butcher's yard. The glint was a discordant note in the butcher's perfectly composed symphony of slaughter. His hands trembling, making the spyglass shake, Reverend Hale raised it to his eye once more. He struggled to find the spot again, scanning the rows of curing meat with a frantic intensity. The world through the small lens was a blur of motion and distorted color. He steadied his hand against the wooden frame of the steeple window, taking a deep, ragged breath to calm the frantic pounding in his chest. He focused the lens, the brass growing warm and slick in his sweaty palm. The image slowly sharpened, the individual strips of meat coming into clear, horrifying view. And then he saw it again. It was not a trick of the light. It was real. It was hanging from the end of one of the longest, thickest strips of meat, partially obscured by the dark, drying flesh but unmistakably there. The air left his lungs in a silent gasp. The object was a small, tarnished silver cross, intricately carved, hanging from a worn leather cord that was looped around the meat itself. It twisted slowly in the faint morning breeze, catching the sun in brief, brilliant flashes. He didn't need a closer look. He knew that cross. He had seen it every Sunday, resting against the sun-browned chest of Elias Vance. The young ranch hand had spoken of it with pride. A family heirloom passed down from his grandfather, a man who had carried it from the old country. Elias had worn it constantly, a symbol of a faith and a heritage that he held dear. He had sworn he would never take it off, and now it was serving as a grotesque ornament on a piece of curing meat in the yard of the very man Elias had accused. A profound, visceral sickness washed over Reverend Hale. He stumbled back from the window, dropping the spyglass with a clatter onto the wooden floor. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the solid floor of the steeple feeling like the deck of a storm-tossed ship. The faint, savory aroma of curing jerky that always hung in the town's air, a scent he had once found comforting, now filled his senses with the cloying sweetness of rot and decay. It was the smell of a charnel house masquerading as a kitchen. The rhythmic, distant thud of Blackwood's cleaver, which had just begun its daily work, was no longer the sound of a craftsman at his trade. It was the sound of a methodical, unholy disassembly. The truth, in its full, monstrous scope, had finally revealed itself not in a whisper, but in a single, silent flash of silver. The pieces fell into place with the brutal, irrefutable logic of a nightmare. The disappearances, the town's casual indifference, the phrase, "they just moved on." It was all a lie, a comfortable fiction to mask an insatiable slaughter. Silas Blackwood was not merely a cheat or a man with a cold heart. He was a predator of the highest and most patient order. He was harvesting the forgotten, the transient, the people society had already deemed disposable, and rendering them into a celebrated delicacy. The generous donation to the church pantry, the jerky that had fed the hungry families of his own congregation, was an act of cannibalistic communion, a perversion so profound it bordered on the satanic. The entire town of Redemption Gulch, with its simple piety and its frontier pragmatism, had been dining on its own lost souls. Lowering himself to the dusty floor of the steeple, Reverend Hale felt the weight of his discovery settle upon him like a burial shroud. The sun was now fully risen, bathing the town in a brilliant, unforgiving light that seemed to mock the darkness he now saw everywhere. His initial suspicions, which had felt like the paranoid fantasies of an outsider, had hardened into a terrible, unassailable certainty. He was no longer just a minister concerned for a missing member of his flock. He was now the sole witness to an ongoing atrocity, the only person in Redemption Gulch who knew the butcher's secret ingredient. The question was no longer what was happening, but what he, a man of God, armed with nothing but a horrifying truth, could possibly do to stop it. The hunt had ended, and a new, far more dangerous struggle was about to begin. Forced from the steeple by the morning sun, Reverend Hale descended into a world irrevocably altered. The familiar sights of Redemption Gulch, the weathered storefronts, the slow-moving wagons kicking up dust, now seemed like a meticulously crafted stage set for an ongoing slaughter. The knowledge he carried was not a key, but a poison seeping into his every thought. Every friendly nod from a parishioner, every child's laugh, felt obscene against the backdrop of his terrible certainty. He was no longer a shepherd to a flock. He was the sole, silent witness to a pack of wolves devouring itself. His mission of bringing grace to the frontier had been grotesquely inverted. Now, his singular, terrifying purpose was to prove that the town's most respected citizen was, in fact, its most prolific monster, a task for which his divinity school had offered no preparation. His investigation began not with an accusation, but with the quiet rustle of paper. He first sought out the town's official records, housed in a small, cluttered room at the back of the marshal's office. The ledger was a thick, leather-bound volume, its pages filled with entries on land claims, business licenses, and the occasional registered birth or death. He spent hours poring over the spidery script, his finger tracing lines of faded ink. What he found was a chronicle of the established, a history of the propertied and the permanent, of the drifters, the prospectors, the railroad workers, the men without names or stakes. There was virtually no mention. They were ghosts in the official narrative, their arrivals and departures unrecorded, their very existence a matter of civic indifference. The town's memory had been deliberately curated to exclude the very people Blackwood targeted. Returning to the hollow sanctuary of his own church, Hale turned to the ecclesiastical records. He unsealed the parish ledger, a book meant to track the spiritual life of the community from cradle to grave. He scanned the lists of baptisms, marriages, and burials, searching for any name that might correspond to the vanished. Here, too, he found a void. These men had lived and died outside the bounds of communal sacrament. They had not been welcomed into the faith, nor had they been commended to God in death. They were footnotes at best, their souls as unrecorded as their presence in the town ledger. This documentary silence was more damning than any confession. It was the sound of a society that had preemptively erased its victims, making the butcher's work not only possible, but effortless. It was in a dusty, forgotten sea chest tucked away in the church vestry that he found his Rosetta Stone of the macabre. Beneath a pile of moth-eaten vestments and hymnals with broken spines lay another book, far older and more personal than the official church ledger. It was the private journal of his predecessor, Reverend Gideon Croft, a man who had served the town for 30 years before succumbing to consumption. The leather cover was cracked and brittle, the pages yellowed and smelling of dust and slow decay. As Hale lifted it, the book felt impossibly heavy, a repository of unspoken history. He had no way of knowing that he was holding the only comprehensive list of Silas Blackwood's victims, a meticulous accounting of the forgotten penned by a man who had made it his quiet mission to remember them. He carried the journal to his small study, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. For hours, he read through Reverend Croft's mundane entries, a chronicle of a lonely life on the frontier, notes on the weather, struggles with his sermons, descriptions of the sparse congregation. It was a portrait of a quiet, observant man. Then, about halfway through the volume, he found what he was looking for. A new section began, its heading written in a careful, deliberate hand, a registry of lost souls. Here, Croft had abandoned his daily chronicle and begun a different kind of accounting. He had started to record the names and brief descriptions of the transient men who passed through Redemption Gulch, seeking a moment of spiritual counsel, a small loan, or simply a kind word. The entries were short but deeply humanizing. June 12, 1878, one read, "Spoke today with Jebediah Stone, a prospector from Missouri with hands like worn leather and eyes full of a desperate hope. He carried a worn photograph of a wife and daughter he hoped to send for. He asked for a prayer for fortune." Another entry, from a year later, September 4th, 1879. A young man, Finn O'Malley from Cork, Ireland, fell from a work train and sought shelter. He had a quick laugh and a shock of red hair. He shared his bread with me and spoke of the green hills of his home. Each entry was a miniature portrait, a small act of bearing witness, transforming the anonymous drifters into men of flesh and blood, with histories and hopes. Reverend Croft had provided a voice for the voiceless. As Hale read, a cold, sickening sense of synchronicity began to dawn on him. He cross-referenced the dates in the journal with his own memories of his short time in town, and with conversations he'd had with older residents about Blackwood's business. He remembered Mrs. Gable mentioning the bountiful autumn batch of jerky in '79, the one that had been the talk of the county fair. According to Reverend Croft's journal, Finn O'Malley had last been seen in town on September 4th, 1879. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. He searched for Jebediah Stone's name in the town's memory and found nothing. But he recalled a comment from a rancher about the summer of '78, when Blackwood's jerky was so plentiful and cheap, he could afford to feed it to his dogs. The journal became an instrument of pure horror. Page after page, name after name, the pattern became undeniable. A brutal mathematical formula of death and commerce. A disappearance recorded by Croft was invariably followed by a period of unusual prosperity at Blackwood's fine meats. The special batches, the bountiful seasons, the celebrated flavors, they were all markers on a timeline of slaughter. The book was not just a registry of lost souls. It was Silas Blackwood's secret harvest calendar. Hale felt a profound, chilling respect for his predecessor, a man who, without ever knowing it, had meticulously documented a series of heinous crimes while simply trying to honor the forgotten. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was also circumstantial, contained within the pages of a dead man's private diary. The change in Reverend Hale did not go unnoticed. His sermons, once filled with hopeful messages of redemption, now carried a dark undercurrent, filled with allusions to wolves in sheep's clothing and the quiet, insidious nature of evil. His gaze during services would often drift toward Silas Blackwood, a stare of such focused, burning intensity that it was almost a physical force. The butcher, a man attuned to the subtle shifts in his environment, felt the preacher's scrutiny like a change in the weather. The quiet, respectful dynamic between the two men had curdled into a silent, undeclared war. Blackwood, for the first time since beginning his enterprise, had a problem. He had an observer, and an observer was the one thing his meticulous system could not tolerate. Blackwood's response was not one of overt aggression, but of insidious psychological pressure. One Sunday, after a particularly pointed sermon on false piety, the butcher approached the pulpit during the collection. Instead of his usual modest contribution, he placed a heavy, clinking leather pouch onto the collection plate, its weight making the brass plate bow. He looked directly at Hale, his expression a placid mask, and said in a low voice, "For only the Reverend to hear, for the church pantry, Reverend, so you may continue to feed the hungry and the lost." It was a gesture of profound corruption, an attempt to make Hale a paid accomplice, to implicate the church itself in his monstrous enterprise. The coins felt less like a donation and more like the price of silence. A few days later, the threat became more explicit, though it was still wrapped in the butcher's characteristic calm. Hale was leaving the general store when Blackwood seemed to materialize at his side, moving with his usual silent grace. "A fine day, Reverend," the butcher began, his voice smooth as polished stone. "A man of God has a heavy burden in a place like this. So many souls to tend to." He paused, looking out at the dusty street. "It is wise for a shepherd to focus on his own flock. This territory is full of dangers for those who wander into another man's pasture. Snakes in the grass. A man can get bit if he isn't careful where he steps." The words were calm, conversational, but the meaning was as sharp and cold as a freshly honed cleaver. The encounter left Hale trembling, not with fear, but with a mixture of terror and righteous fury. The butcher's warning confirmed everything. He was no longer just an investigator, he was now the hunted. He began to feel Blackwood's presence everywhere. He would see the man's reflection in a shop window, catch his silhouette standing motionless across the street at dusk, or feel a sudden chill as if unseen eyes were watching him through the windows of the parsonage. The town, which had once felt alien, now felt actively hostile, as if every citizen were an extension of Blackwood's will. The sanctuary of his church began to feel like a trap, its thin wooden walls offering no protection from the patient, methodical evil that now knew his name. Knowing he could not act alone, Hale resolved to approach the one man in Redemption Gulch with the authority to act, Town Marshal Cyrus Thorne. Thorne was a large, pragmatic man whose interpretation of the law was notoriously flexible, prioritizing the peace of the town's influential citizens above all else. Hale found him in the saloon, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He presented his case carefully, speaking of the alarming number of disappearances, of Elias Vance, and of his deep, unshakable suspicions about Silas Blackwood. He deliberately held back the journal, wanting to gauge the marshal's reaction first. Thorne listened with a look of bored amusement, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. When Hale had finished, the marshal let out a short, derisive laugh. "Reverend," he said, shaking his head, "you've been out in the sun too long. You Easterners come out here with your books and your delicate sensibilities, and you see monsters in every shadow. He took a long drink of his whiskey. Silas Blackwood is a pillar of this community, a God-fearing, hard-working man. And these drifters, they're like the wind, Reverend. They blow in and they blow out. It ain't my job to track the direction of the wind. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have important business to attend to. He clapped Hale on the shoulder, a gesture of final, patronizing dismissal, and turned back to the bar. The marshal's rebuff was a devastating blow. It confirmed Hale's deepest fear. The system itself was Blackwood's greatest accomplice. The town's apathy, codified in the person of its chief lawman, provided the perfect cover for the butcher's atrocities. Justice was a commodity reserved for those who mattered, and the men in Reverend Croft's journal had never mattered to anyone but him. Hale walked out of the saloon into the blinding afternoon light, feeling more isolated than ever before. He was a man armed with an unthinkable truth in a town that refused to see it. The official channels were closed to him. The path of the law had led to a dead end. He returned to his study, the silence of the church pressing in on him. He sat at his desk and opened the old journal once more, its brittle pages whispering as he turned them. The names of the lost souls stared up at him from the faded ink: Jebediah Stone, Finn O'Malley, and dozens more. They were his congregation now, a silent flock demanding justice from beyond the grave. The marshal's words echoed in his mind, clarifying his position with brutal finality. If he wanted to stop the butcher, he could not rely on the law, on the community, or even on his own faith. He would have to find a different way. He would need proof that no one, not even a cynical marshal, could dismiss. The sun began to set, painting the walls of his study in hues of blood and fire. Reverend Hale looked out the window toward Blackwood's immaculate shop, where the lights were now being extinguished for the night. The investigation was over. He had uncovered the woe, the how, and the why. He understood the terrible mechanics of the evil that had taken root in Redemption Gulch. But knowledge was not enough. To expose a monster who operated in plain sight, he would have to descend into the darkness himself. He would have to find the butcher's larder, the secret place where the raw material for his celebrated jerky was stored. The hunt for evidence was finished. The hunt for the charnel house was about to begin. His hand rested on the cool, worn leather of the journal. He was no longer just a man of God. He was an archivist of the dead, the custodian of a truth so vile it threatened to consume him. He knew that Silas Blackwood would not hesitate to add a preacher's name to his list of ingredients. The risk was absolute, but as he looked at the names in the journal, he felt a resolve harden within him, a cold, righteous anger that burned away his fear. These men would not remain forgotten. Their stories would be told, and their killer would be brought to account. The thought was not a prayer, but a vow, sealed in the dying light of the Arizona day. Armed with Reverend Gideon Croft's journal, a ledger of the dead, Thomas Hale made one final, desperate appeal to Town Marshal Cyrus Thorne. He laid the book open on the marshal's dusty desk, his finger tracing the names of the lost souls, juxtaposing the dates of their disappearance with the documented periods of Silas Blackwood's uncanny prosperity. He spoke not with the pleading tone of a concerned citizen, but with the cold, unshakable certainty of a prophet delivering a terrible revelation. Thorne, a man who dealt in the tangible currency of bullets and gold, was visibly unnerved by the preacher's righteous fury. He looked from the journal to Hale's burning eyes and, with a heavy sigh of resignation, agreed to the search. He did not believe a word of it, but he knew the only way to silence this obsessive preacher was to confront the supposed phantom head-on. The procession to Blackwood's fine meats was a grim, silent affair. Marshal Thorne, Reverend Hale, and a single, nervous deputy walked through the midday sun, their boots kicking up clouds of ochre dust. The usual cacophony of Redemption Gulch seemed to quiet as they passed, the town's residents sensing the gravity of the moment, their faces appearing in windows and doorways. They arrived at the immaculate, whitewashed facade of the butcher shop. Silas Blackwood emerged from the doorway, wiping his hands on his pristine white apron. He greeted the marshal with a placid, almost welcoming nod, his eyes betraying no surprise, no fear, no emotion whatsoever. His composure was a wall of unnerving calm against which the marshal's authority seemed to break and dissipate, rendering the official visit feel like an unwelcome social call. The initial search of the main shop yielded nothing but evidence of meticulous professionalism. The wooden floors were scrubbed clean, the brass scales on the counter gleamed, and the air carried the wholesome, savory aroma of smoked paprika and cured meat. Every knife and cleaver was perfectly honed and arranged in its proper place on a magnetic rack. Marshal Thorne walked the length of the counter, his skepticism returning with every sterile detail he observed. He turned to Hale, his expression a mixture of annoyance and vindication, ready to declare the matter closed and reprimand the preacher for wasting his time on a wild, slanderous fantasy. The shop was a testament not to murder, but to an obsessive, almost holy, dedication to the craft of butchery. But Reverend Hale would not be deterred. His memory of the steeple, of the glinting silver cross, was a brand on his mind. He pointed toward a door at the back of the shop. "The cellar, Marshal," he insisted, his voice low but firm. "We must see the root cellar." Silas Blackwood, who had been observing the proceedings with a detached interest, simply nodded his assent. He made no protest, offered no excuse. He led the men through a small back room, past sacks of spices and salt, to a heavy wooden door that led downwards into the cool earth. His compliance was more unsettling than any resistance could have been. It was the quiet confidence of a man who believed his secrets were buried too deep for any lawman to find. The descent into the darkness began. The root cellar was cool and damp, the air thick with the earthy smell of potatoes and turnips stored in wooden bins. From the low-beamed ceiling hung links of sausage and slabs of cured bacon, their familiar, comforting shapes casting long, dancing shadows in the wavering light of the marshal's lantern. On the surface, it was the larder of a successful and industrious purveyor. Yet, Hale's eyes scanned the packed earth floor, searching for any sign of disturbance. He found it in the far corner, partially obscured by a large, heavy shipping crate. The earth there was darker, more loosely packed than the surrounding ground. As he pointed it out, the deputy noticed the crate wasn't resting flat. It was propped up, covering something on the floor. At the marshal's command, the deputy strained to move the heavy crate aside. Beneath it, just as Hale had suspected, was a crude trapdoor, its rough-hewn planks flush with the floor. A single, heavy iron ring set into its center. The discovery sent a palpable chill through the small, enclosed space, a silent acknowledgement that they had crossed a threshold from a formal inquiry into something far more sinister. Silas Blackwood stood by the stone wall, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask. He watched the proceedings with the placid curiosity of a landowner observing men digging a well on his property. The silence in the cellar was absolute, broken only by the deputy's grunts of effort and the rasp of wood against earth as he struggled to get a purchase on the iron ring. With a final, desperate heave, the deputy pulled the trapdoor open. It swung upwards with a groan of protest from its rusty hinges, revealing a square of perfect, impenetrable blackness below. From this opening erupted a stench so foul, so profoundly unholy, that it defied description. It was a thick, gagging wave of putrefaction, a cloying sweetness of rot and old dust's congealed blood that instantly overpowered the wholesome smells of the cellar. Marshal Thorne, a man hardened by the battlefields and barroom brawls of the frontier, stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth as he fought a wave of violent nausea. In that single, horrific moment, his world of pragmatic law and order was shattered, replaced by the certainty that he stood at the very mouth of hell itself. They lowered the lantern into the abyss. The flickering light cut through the darkness, illuminating a deep, narrow pit dug into the earth. The bottom was a grotesque, tangled tapestry of human remains. Dozens of bones, femurs, ribs, vertebrae, were piled in a chaotic heap, all of them stripped bare, bearing the fine, precise score marks of a butcher's knife. Skulls, some fractured, stared up from the bottom of the pit with the hollow, vacant eyes of the damned. It was an ossuary of the forgotten, a final, secret resting place for the men Reverend Croft had named in his journal. Among the bones, the lantern light caught the glint of small, personal effects: a tarnished silver belt buckle, a set of mother-of-pearl buttons, a dented prospector's tin pan, each object a final, silent testament to a life violently erased. On a rough-hewn table next to the pit, a set of specialized tools was laid out with surgical precision. These were not the heavy, practical cleavers and saws from the shop above. These were instruments of a more delicate, more intimate, and far more sinister purpose. There were long, slender filleting knives, their blades worn thin from years of use, hacksaws with fine wire, sharp teeth designed for disarticulating joints with minimal effort, and an array of hooks for hoisting and manipulating flesh. At the end of the row lay 3 mallets. Their heavy leather heads stained a deep, bulky, dark brown with years of dried blood. They were the tools not of a butcher who prepared cattle, but of a predator who methodically disassembled his own kind, a craftsman in the art of human deconstruction. Driven by a terrible, cold logic, Reverend Hale knew the pit was not the final horror. The bones were old. The ranch hand Elias Vance was a recent victim. His gaze fell upon the thick, insulated door of the smokehouse, an outbuilding connected to the cellar by a short stone passage. The sweet, nauseating stench was even stronger here, mingling with the acrid smell of creosote and hickory smoke. Inside, the air was thick and warm. A few strips of the butcher's famous jerky hung from the rafters, but in the darkest corner of the small room stood a large wooden barrel, its lid sealed tight with tallow. A dark, viscous fluid had seeped from the seams, pooling on the stone floor. This was the final stage of the process, the place where the raw material was prepared. The deputy, his face pale and slick with sweat, took a crowbar to the barrel's lid. With a sickening crack of splintering wood, he pried it open. The men recoiled from the contents. Submerged in a dark, murky brine was the dismembered body of Elias Vance. His limbs had been expertly separated from his torso, packed tightly to fit within the confines of the barrel. As the deputy reached in, he pulled out a pale, wrinkled human hand. The skin puckered from its immersion in the salt solution. There, still tied around the wrist by a leather cord, was the small, tarnished silver cross that had started it all. The definitive proof was here, floating in a grotesque stew of salt and blood, the final, undeniable evidence that obliterated any remaining doubt and confirmed the full, monstrous scope of Silas Blackwood's enterprise. They found the butcher back in his shop, calmly polishing the brass scales on his countertop. The scene was surreal, a moment of placid domesticity unfolding just feet above a charnel house. He offered no resistance as Marshal Thorne approached, his face a grim mask of fury and disgust. Blackwood simply placed his polishing cloth on the counter and turned, presenting his wrists for the shackles. There was no attempt to flee, no plea for mercy, no flicker of fear in his cold, placid eyes. His capture was a quiet, anticlimactic procedure, his serene compliance a final, chilling testament to a conscience utterly devoid of guilt. He was not a man caught in a crime, but an artist interrupted in his work. In the small, suffocating confines of the marshal's office, Silas Blackwood delivered his confession. His voice never wavered, maintaining a calm, even monotone, as he recounted years of methodical slaughter. He spoke of his victims not as people, but as stock or raw material. He explained his selection process with a chilling, pragmatic logic. He chose the rootless, the friendless, the forgotten, those whose absence from the world would create no ripples, no inconvenient questions. He would lure them to his shop with the promise of a hot meal or a day's wages, an act of seeming charity that was merely the first step in his harvesting process. He detailed these preliminaries with the detached air of a rancher, describing how he culled a herd. His account of the act itself was delivered with the same unnerving calm. He described the final moment with a craftsman's pride in his efficiency, a single, perfectly placed blow to the base of the skull with one of the leather mallets. "It is quick," he stated, his eyes meeting the marshal's. "There is no struggle, no unnecessary spoilage of the meat." He then recounted the process of butchery in the cellar, the meticulous skinning and filleting, the careful separation of muscle from bone. He spoke of the sun as his partner, the final, crucial element in his recipe. The relentless Arizona sun, he explained, was a great purifier. It baked away the identity, the sin, the very humanity of the flesh, transforming it into something sublime, something celebrated, something worthy of his brand. In his mind, he was not a murderer. He was an alchemist, turning the dross of society into gold. The trial of Silas Blackwood was not a spectacle of justice, but a public autopsy of a town's soul. Held in the makeshift courthouse, the proceedings were a litany of horrors read into the official record. The confession of the butcher, delivered by a clerk in a flat, emotionless voice, filled the tense silence of the room. But it was the reading of Reverend Gideon Croft's journal that truly broke the community. As the names of the lost souls, Jebediah Stone, Finn O'Malley, and dozens more, were spoken aloud for the first time, they were no longer anonymous drifters. They became men with histories, with hopes, with faces now imagined by the very people who had consumed them. The townsfolk of Redemption Gulch sat in stunned, nauseated silence, forced to confront the fact that their celebrated local delicacy was, in fact, a communion of the damned, and the price of their prosperity had been paid in human blood. The verdict was a formality, the sentence an inevitability. Silas Blackwood was condemned to hang in the very town square where his customers had once praised his craft. On the day of the execution, a somber, silent crowd gathered, their faces a mixture of grim resolve and profound, unshakable shame. When Blackwood was led to the gallows, he showed no fear, no remorse, no flicker of any human emotion. His eyes, cold and placid, scanned the faces below him, not as a condemned man seeking a final connection, but as a craftsman assessing his clientele one last time. As the rope was placed around his neck, his final words were not a plea to God, but a quiet, chilling statement to the marshal. The sun was the secret. It purifies all things. He was a man utterly convinced of his own grotesque artistry, a monster who saw no distinction between his victims and the cattle he had once slaughtered. In the immediate aftermath of the execution, a palpable sickness settled over Redemption Gulch. The horror did not end with Blackwood's death. It had merely been given a name. Neighbors who had once shared his famous jerky at church picnics now looked at each other with a mixture of suspicion and shared guilt. The savory aroma that had once defined the town was now a phantom scent that triggered waves of nausea and self-disgust. Every butcher shop in the territory saw its business plummet. The simple act of buying meat now irrevocably tainted. The town's singular pride had become its deepest, most unspeakable shame, a secret knowledge that poisoned every meal and every memory. Redemption Gulch had not been redeemed. It had been damned by a truth it could never unlearn, forced to live with the knowledge of its own unwitting cannibalism. Several nights after the hanging, a group of silent, grim-faced men marched to the now-abandoned butcher shop. It was not a mob driven by chaotic rage, but a congregation performing a solemn, necessary ritual of purgation. With lanterns and torches, they set the immaculate Kyr's whitewashed building ablaze. The structure that had been a monument to meticulous evil was consumed by a cleansing fire, the flames licking at the desert sky. The fire burned for hours, the intense heat cracking the foundation and turning the butcher's tools to warped, useless metal. The scent that rose from the inferno was not of wood and paint, but of old, rendered fat and scorched bone that had seeped into the very timbers of the building. They were not just burning a shop, they were attempting to burn away a memory, to cauterize a wound on the soul of their community. The legacy of the Sunshine Butcher seeped into the cultural bedrock of the region, creating a taboo that would endure for generations. In Redemption Gulch and the surrounding territories, the consumption of jerky became an act of profound social transgression. To offer it to a guest was an insult. To be seen eating it was to invite suspicion and disgust. The food, once a staple of frontier life, was transformed into a symbol of a monstrous secret. Parents used the story to frighten their children into obedience, speaking in hushed tones of the pious butcher who made treats from the bodies of wanderers. The tale became a grim reminder that the most ordinary things can conceal the most profound horrors, and that evil often wears the mask of respectability. The name Silas Blackwood was a curse whispered on the wind. Reverend Thomas Hale, the man who had pulled back the curtain on the town's nightmare, could not remain. The very faces of his congregation were now a constant reminder of the horror he had unearthed. He saw not a flock to be guided, but a collection of unwilling accomplices, their innocence lost forever. His presence was a source of shame for the community, a living monument to the truth they desperately wished to forget. He had come to Redemption Gulch to save souls, but had instead become the archivist of their damnation. Within a year of the trial, he quietly packed his few belongings, left Reverend Croft's journal in the care of the church, and left town. In a final, bitter irony, the man who had given a voice to the forgotten became another soul who simply moved on, swallowed by the vast, indifferent expanse of the West. The plot of land where Blackwood's fine meats had once stood became a blighted, haunted scar on the landscape of Redemption Gulch. No one ever dared to build upon the scorched earth. Locals claimed the ground was poisoned, that nothing would ever grow there again except for the hardiest desert weeds. For decades, stories circulated among the town's residents and travelers passing through. They spoke of a faint, rhythmic thudding sound that could be heard on still, moonless nights, the phantom echo of a cleaver on a wooden block. Others swore that on hot summer afternoons, if the wind blew just right, you could still catch a faint, cloying scent drifting from the empty lot, the sweet, smoky aroma of a fresh batch of jerky being laid out to cure under the relentless, purifying sun. Over time, the historical facts of the case began to blur, eroding under the weight of myth and oral tradition. The specific names in Reverend Croft's journal faded from memory, and the grim reality of the trial was replaced by a more potent, folkloric narrative. Silas Blackwood, the man, was transformed into the Sunshine Butcher, a spectral figure, a bogeyman of the Arizona Territory. He became less a historical murderer and more a personification of the frontier's inherent dangers, a cautionary tale about the smiling stranger, the veneer of civilization, and the darkness that can fester in a place where people can disappear without a trace. The legend served as a brutal reminder that in a land of desperate ambition, the most successful predator is often the one you invite into your home and praise for his craft. This leaves us with the final, unsettling question that hangs over the ashes of Redemption Gulch. Was Silas Blackwood a singular, aberrant monster, a man born without a soul, whose evil was an anomaly in an otherwise decent world? Or was he something far more terrifying, the logical product of his environment? Was his cruelty merely a reflection of a society that had already deemed his victims worthless? A community whose pervasive indifference created the perfect ecosystem for his art to flourish? The horror of the Sunshine Butcher may not lie in the actions of one man, but in the silent complicity of an entire town that chose not to see, and in doing so, held the plate while the monster served his feast. The darkest chapters of our history are often the ones most easily forgotten, buried in unmarked graves and dusty, unread journals. They linger as local legends, their warnings fading with each passing generation. To ensure that these accounts are never fully erased, that the shadows of the past remain to teach us, we ask you to join our work, subscribe to this channel, and help us preserve the archive of the forgotten,